Our next session is on a border that works for SMEs. And I've got three people, probably no one could be better qualified than our panel. We've got Suella Braverman, who will be chairing the panel, MP for Fareham and former Brexit Minister. I have in the middle Neil MacDonald, who is the CEO of SME, which is the Irish SME Association. And on my immediate left, I've got, who's already been on one of the panels already, Hans Meissen, who is an independent customs advisor. So thank you very much indeed. Do take your seat right away. And at this point, I'll hand over to Suella. Suella.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Greg, for that introduction. And yes, I'm Member of Parliament for Fareham and a former Minister at the Department for Exiting the EU. And it's a great honour to be involved as a Commissioner in the Alternative Arrangements Commission. And I just want to place on record my thanks to Greg, Nikki, Prosperity UK, technical panel and all the other commissioners for the hours of work that have gone into producing this study, which I'm sure will contribute positively to the discussion as we go forward. The focus of the next 45, 50 minutes is the impact on small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, which make up, of course, the majority of businesses that will be affected at the Northern Irish border. And it's covered at many points in this interim report, but in most detail, I guess, at chapter 12, which looks at the profile of the businesses that are affected, some of the existing regime under the WTO rules and operational facilitations, and it also makes several recommendations that I hope we'll draw out in the session today. And we've got two authoritative experts to talk about both sides of this issue. Hans Meissen is an independent customs advisor for businesses and government, and he has a breadth of experience in the sector, from chairman of the Customs Board of FENEX, which is the Dutch Association of Forwarders and Customs Brokers, to running his own business, Mako Customs Service. I don't know if I've pronounced that properly.
That's correct.
And he's also been sitting on the technical panel of experts under this commission and has actually inputted into the recommendations using his experience. And Neil MacDonald, who is the CEO of the Irish SME Association, who is here really to speak on behalf of approximately 10,000 SMEs in the Republic. He served 15 years in the Irish Defence Forces, but has, again, an extensive background in business for Hoya Island and also in petroleum distribution for Wincanton Island. And I'm sure we'll, again, move our discussion forward. So what I'm proposing is to ask a few questions of our experts, to draw out some points, and then open it out to the floor. So please do think about any points that you'd like to raise. So, Neil, I'm going to start with you, first of all. Could you just set out for us a bit of the context of and the character of Irish trade when it comes to the border and how that's affected?
Will do. If I could just start again by echoing the thanks of others for the amount of work that Shankar and the technical team have put into that. Compiling such a compendium of 200 pages work on alternative arrangements, I'm just positing the notion that if people understood that level of complexity was required just in resolving the Irish border back in Q1 of 2016, I wonder what the views of people would have been. And don't forget that that's just the Irish border. So we haven't touched aviation, we haven't touched shipping standards, all that stuff. So there's an absolute mountain of detail to climb here, which I don't think people genuinely absorbed. People thought this was a very binary decision. However, from a small business perspective, and just I explained to Suella earlier on, in the Republic, if I just put some big numbers on this, about 250,000 companies, 130,000 of those are sole traders, doctors, solicitors, accountants, taxi drivers. You have about 120,000 companies with more than one employee. 500 are the big guys. So Europe likes to think that Ireland is a brass plate for American companies. It isn't. We have absolutely an American footprint in Dublin that's so large now, it's actually quite troubling if you're an SME. So we've about 120,000 companies, and SMEs, their first foray into export will be NI first, go north, and then go west into GB. Then to characterize Irish trade, the largest single country, a lot of people don't quite get, is the United States, because we have such a services east-west with them. Then when you look at in big blocks, the EU has, for quite a number of years, the bloc has exceeded the UK, which was traditionally our biggest trading partner. But within the EU, the UK is our largest trading partner. And then the third layer, which is the real area this starts getting a little bit squeaky and sweaty for SMEs, is SMEs tend to be at the lower value added end of the spectrum. So you're dealing with people whose profitability is in the single digits. And that's why I'm here as much to listen as I am to speak on behalf of people, but talking to Hans and others, you know, if the cost of these measures is beyond the single digit, and I mean, you know, more than 1% or even approaching 1%, there are businesses that are marginal already. And that's before you take into account what's been going on with sterling for the last 3 or 4 years. So this does have, even if these measures are deliverable right away, if there's a significant cost to them, they will have trade-altering effects.
Thank you. And then zooming in to the SMEs that you represent and that are affected, again, you can give us a flavour of the character and, again, the scale of their operations.
So without boring people too much with the figures, but the integration of Irish UK trade is interesting because the UK has a goods surplus with Ireland, and Ireland has a services surplus with the UK. So we're highly integrated economies. We oversell services to you, and we buy a lot of finished goods. And actually an awful lot of the north-south element is actually integrated into that. So for both NI and ROI, GB trade, in other words, the east-west trade, as people are, you know, remind themselves regularly, is more important for both. Relatively speaking, though, from an export perspective, the ROI is much less dependent on the NI trade, is relatively negligible compared to east-west. However, for NI businesses, and most especially, I just looking at the figures last night, 80% of Northern Ireland micros export to the south only. So from an NI perspective, that north-south trade is highly important. And also what people don't understand is that a huge amount of the east-west from ROI to GB would have an NI component in it. So it's actually very complex. So you get goods which may go north and south. Guinness is a great example. It's brewed in Dublin, it's canned in Belfast, it comes back down again, and then it goes over to Holyhead. So you have really, really complex integrated supply chains that it's not that any of this stuff isn't doable or feasible in the long run. It's that if you attempt to do this stuff in a big bang, you're going to have an impact. If I get scientific rather than political, the Higgs boson was discovered or posited in 1964, but no one could prove it was there until 2012, right? So 48 years to prove something that a Brit said was around in 1964. So what we don't want to find as an SME community is that this stuff is technically deliverable in 5 years when we're all out of business. Okay, so that's our sensitivity around this.
60 years, you're saying it might take?
I said 48 years, but we did have to build the Large Hadron Collider to get there, so we just want to keep it simple.
So cost and time for delivery will be critical for SMEs. What would you say is the mood of businesses that you represent in light of those challenges that might be on the horizon?
It's a bit of a roller coaster. It's like a very intense early relationship. If we say looking east at a new partner or someone we thought we knew. So when we had the vote, a lot of people think that the Irish were kind of wishfully or wistfully thinking about this. The only EU country that had a contingency plan good to go on the Monday after the vote was Ireland. So Ireland never underestimated the possibility that this would occur, and did understand the internal tensions in Britain and England especially. I think perhaps, and I don't want to get into any of the political areas about this, but probably one of the missteps was with the activation of Article 50 and the Britain effectively hemming herself in with loads of red lines that really didn't have to be set out. So that has set a direction of travel that's much narrower than it could have been. So that has affected our mood. So in that, if the trade is as constrained as it potentially is around issues of single market and customs union, those issues were not identified as Brexit must-haves or red lines before the referendum. That's the sort of thing that people went, you know, if there was a Norwegian, an Icelandic, a Swiss direction of travel that had been suggested by many people campaigning for Brexit beforehand, I think we could have lived with that. Some of the stuff since that has happened has been very concerning. And this year in particular, I have to say, from our membership sales point of view, as we came up to the March deadline, I can just tell you we had our worst new membership sales figures since 2011, back in the bust. And we thought we would come out of that then in Q2, and the message we were getting from people was, hey, we upstocked, we stockpiled, and we're liquidating stocks now. So from where I'm sitting now at the end of June, I'm looking at exactly the same process potentially coming into Halloween, and people are going to start taking decisions with inventory. Despite what an earlier speaker said about marching up the hill and marching down again, people will get defensive and will start thinking about this. And if we have another extension, then we just need to have some clarity about direction of travel for the future.
Right. Very, very, very useful insights there. Hans, as a contributor to this section or this issue, can you explain to the audience and take us through essentially how a border without infrastructure can work for SMEs?
Yes, thank you. When when was it, in December 2017, there would be a new proposal to organize the Irish border. I was very interested because as a customs broker, being a customs broker all my life, I thought they're going to come up with something new, which is very interesting, of course, as a professional. But they didn't. And I said, why would you need anything new? Because everything's there. How does a border work? Basically, when you go to a border, you go there, you make an export declaration to exit your customs territory, and on the other side of the border, you immediately make an import declaration to enter the other customs territory. But then you need infrastructure. That's not what we can use in the Northern Irish border. But there's an alternative, that is transit, which is available all in the legislation, IT systems, etc. How does it work? You make an export declaration on your premises or on the premises of your logistic service provider. And this declaration is made digitally and communicated directly to the customs authorities in your country, in your territory, and they can then make a decision if they want to look at the goods or not. Then you make a transit declaration that can take the goods across the border without stopping to the place where you unload. That can be at your premises or the premises of your logistics service provider, and there you make the import declaration. And then again, there's a risk assessment by the government using the digital declaration, and then it can come by to take a look at the goods. That's as simple as it works. This operation is used 10 million times a year in the European Union and with countries outside it. The transit system is up and running. It's in the Union Customs Code. It's within the UK legislation that you have adopted for after Brexit. And it's perfect. It's been made perfect by the Swiss, for example. Of course, the Swiss are landlocked within the European Union, and they have a lot of trade with their neighboring countries like Germany, France, and Italy, and they use it 2.5 million times a year because the Swiss don't want any stops at the border. They have passes, you know, they don't have any space, and so they transfer the goods to they transfer the declarations to inland for export and import. That's the way it works. And I thought, why didn't you come up with that? Because it's available. And you can use that perfectly as a basis for transactions to be declared after Brexit.
Right. And bearing in mind what Neil said about the character of SMEs and the level of trade, how important do you think it is that there is a border without infrastructure?
Well, it's a requirement, and I'm not a politician, so I can only tell something about the technical issues. I visited Mr. Barnier 2 times, and of course they're very keen on upholding their internal market, etc., and all the procedures they have. We don't want to have any cherry picking and so on. But the point is, the customs system works that every transaction has to be declared. As small as it is, it has to be declared, and that's a problem here, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises. So for every transaction, you would have to make such a declaration that I described, or use simplifications. You will have big companies that can use all kinds of administrative procedures, have high AU standards they comply with, and so on. But what about the small companies? And there are there are a couple of thousands in Northern Ireland, but the Bureau of Statistics in Northern Ireland says there are about 700 trading actively with Ireland. And the average value of a trade is about 1,000 or 3,000 euros. So it's low. A lot of repetitive small trade going back and forth. And we'll have to accommodate that. With these procedures, we can simplify them, or we can get exemptions. And of course, then we come into dealing with the EU, what they can offer, or what you can negotiate with them. Because basically, the European Customs Code has some exemptions, but not that many. And we have to distinguish 4 kinds of goods. One is livestock. The island of Ireland is a biosecurity zone, so that's not really a big problem. Secondly, there are veterinary goods. Veterinary goods are of animal origin, and the EU legislation says they have to be checked at the border inspection posts. We'll come back to that. Then you have SPS goods. They have to be checked as well, not all of them, and they can be checked inland. And then there's the rest of the goods, industrial goods and so on, which can be checked easily inland. So these are the 4 categories we have to look at, and how we can solve that within the framework that I just named. So you have with the inland declarations.
And looking at the existing EU customs legislation, what exists already that could be applied or could be relevant to the recommendations that have been made?
Well, yes, that is a bit where we face the challenge, right? For example, if we want to make these import declarations of veterinary goods at the border, you have these border inspection posts, which are obligatory. But I'm from Holland. I had an office in Rotterdam, and the veterinary post in Rotterdam is 40 kilometers inland. So you would need a transit declaration from the outside terminal to this border inspection point, and take it there, and they can have the inspections. Now, if it's possible there, it should be possible on the island of Ireland as well. And actually, the EU is moving towards that direction. If a train with containers moves through the channel, it won't stop in Calais and take off the containers with veterinary goods and check them there, and the drive goes on. So they'll have to be more flexible on that in that perspective. So I think we should be able to reach an agreement there, but it is a deviation. The regulation says that you cannot have you can have a deviation from a border inspection point if you have a pass, a mountain pass, like which you have in Switzerland. So there are possibilities within the regulations that could be used. Looking at small companies, you could have a system where companies that trade below the VAT threshold are exempt. The VAT threshold in the UK is £85,000. So if your turnover, your yearly turnover, is below £85,000, you don't have to use the VAT law. So you don't have to charge VAT, but you cannot deduct it either. Well, why would I then have to make a customs declaration which is just for VAT if I won't use it anyway in my administration? So we could plead for an exemption in that respect. And of course, then Mr. Barnier will say, yeah, well, it will harm our internal market. I say, oh, well, come on. These are very small transactions, not so many traders, so these are spaces where you can negotiate. And then there are other small things like if you have a field across the border, you can bring in your crops or your sheep without duties. Well, why do you can have these exemptions. And of course, there's the World Trade Organization, the World Trade Organization, which is the border facilitation. And that can be explored to have zones or free trade or zones where you don't have to fulfill the customs obligations which are there. But that all has to be talked about with the European Union.
Any examples or precedents for these, the suggestions which have been put forward?
Well, yeah, there's an example in the paper about dairy farms that export milk on a daily basis from Northern Ireland to Ireland for production. And, there's no sector as regulated in the European Union as agriculture. So there are lots of laws that they have to abide, lots of standards, lots of checks, and so on. So we could use that. The European Union is very keen on securing their supply chain, the food security. There's a system called TRACES. It's named that way, but it also traces the food supply chain from the source to the consumers. So if there's anything wrong, you can go back to the source and solve the problem. Well, the UK can still be in there, and you could, the milk that you source in the UK can still be put in that system, which is very simple, and then sent to Ireland. Now, if the milk has to be checked, it can be done at the factory in Ireland. Because, well, it's checked anyway, right? It has to be good, otherwise it won't be taken into production. You can have this transit declaration, but you can simplify that because, it's there every day. And the European Union is looking for new ways to organize that. One of the things with transit that is relevant in the political discussion is that formally you have to make a barcode scan at the border. So this milk truck would have to stop at the border for a barcode scan, but there is no infrastructure. But this barcode scan just registers that you cross the border. But you can do that with geo-tracking or with any other means of a telephone having a registration of your route that you're taking. So there can be technological innovations or administrative innovations used that all the European Union can benefit of. Some things are just legacy aspects in customs. Well, so we can have all kinds of regulations which are harmonized, or for example, EU inspectors can come to the Northern Irish dairy farm to inspect the production and so on, if it's fit, if it's, for example, there's no hormones in it, so so you can take that into production right away, so you don't need checks. And that's what was called before. We need trust, we need cooperation, we need to discuss that. And then we can solve many of these practical issues on the border.
Neil, any questions or that are provoked by what you've heard Hans talk about there?
Just paying compliment to for those of you who've never worked in logistics, in third-party logistics or logistics within a company, say with Tesco or Sainsbury's, the customs guys were the forgotten people, and they were, not being sexist, they were almost all men. They were generally old, mostly quite overweight, and not.
Oh boy, come on!
And they usually, you could see signs of heavy smoking on their fingers. They are,
That's not fair. That's not fair.
they are now the rock stars.
Okay, now we're talking.
And our guys are, so when Jennifer and Shankar came over to me, these guys are on consulting day rates of between 1,500 and €2,500 a day.
I didn't know that.
So there's always an upside for someone, and because they are trying to demystify something that hasn't actually existed within the union now for 45 years. So for us to execute the measures that we saw in part one before coffee, we really do. This isn't easy. A previous Northern secretary in the 70s said about Northern Ireland, if you're not confused, you haven't been paying attention. And that's a little bit like what it is about customs. There is a way to do this, but if I can simplify a story, where I live in Dublin, Intel, the big American chip manufacturer, is close by. Now, a single container of Pentiums coming out of there is apparently worth, one of these small containers is worth in the tens of millions of dollars. So a per item movement cost of €100 or £100 is lost in the rounding there. But if you're moving what tends to be much lower value product, higher physical volume product, and lower margin product, then a €100 transaction does become meaningful commercially, and that's just our overall concern about this.
Well, that's correct. I mean, you have to declare any transaction. The EU will demand that. We'll look for exemptions and simplifications so costs can decrease. But if you look at a standard transaction like across the Swiss border that I described, which could apply to the Northern Ireland as well, it's between 50 and €100. If you set that up next to the average transaction, which is €1,000, that's too much. So government will have to help there. It'll have to help companies making these declarations themselves, or through logistic service providers or customs brokers, I want to promote those, because indeed we're at the center of attention now. There'll be some need for help, but you will have customs is not sexy. You don't see it, you don't want to be involved in it, but it's there. And there are obligations now, which everybody fulfills. There are administrative, you don't know, that's good. And that'll be the case after Brexit. There'll be people, thick or thin, that make customs formalities, but you won't notice it. There's just a subterra that they take place. But we have to introduce them, because that's when you leave the European Union and the internal market. There's no way around it. You'll run into customs formalities, but we have to make them as simple and as cheap and as accessible as possible.
Very, very, very good. Thank you very much.